All right, let's take this next caller. Caller, welcome to the show. Please tell us your name, where you're calling from.
Hi, this is John from Oregon.
Hello, John from Oregon. Welcome to the show. What's the question for Rabbi?
Okay, so I recently became a Noahide because of reading Let's Get Biblical, Volume 1 and 2, and I had a question from a family member, and one thing led to another, and eventually I made a comment about Christianity not really believing in free will. And so I made the statement that the Christian New Testament says that predestination or election to damnation or salvation is, well, very explicitly proven in the New Testament, and it was because of something I think in Volume 1 that I made that comment. And I know there are dozens of verses in the Christian New Testament that could be applied to predestination or election, but I think there was just one that really stood out. And for the sake of giving a timely answer to my grandmother, I would really like to know which of those verses is the one that could not be interpreted any other way.
As it turns out, those who believe in the doctrine of predestination, I'll explain that very quickly. The doctrine of predestination is a theology that God had preordained who would be saved and who would not be saved, who would be the elect, who would find the gospel irresistible and become Christians, and who was not part of the elect, and therefore they would be burned in hell for eternity because they were unfortunate. They didn't have the good fortune to win the theological lottery, and therefore they're damned to hell forever. I mean, when you think about it, it's a shocking theology. It's a shocking theology. So as it turns out, you're going to find these ideas in a number of places in the New Testament, certainly Romans, you would see it there. It's really shocking. Calvin and those who are Calvinists from the Reformed Church would defend this as based on what's called, they would refer to simply as the sovereignty of God. God is sovereign over all matter, and therefore it's all been decided. I mean, what kind of a God that would decide before the foundation of the earth would be set who would go to heaven, who would go to hell? Means you're roasting an eternal damn, burning in a lake of fire and gnashing teeth for nothing you could have done. Nothing you could have done. I mean, it's really a shock. Now, not all Christians accept this. Many Christians, like John Wesley, the founder of the Methodist movement, he would reject it. Others would reject this as well, based on verses in the Christian Bible as well as the Jewish scriptures, because the Christian Bible is not monolithic. You have Pauline theology, and in Romans he is advancing the idea that man is so utterly a sinful creature, read Romans 3 for yourself, that there's no way that any person could possibly accept the Jesus unless God made him to accept Jesus. That's how messed up we are on. In Romans 3, he actually misquotes Psalm 14 and a whole series of other verses. He misjams them together and produces. Now, the reason is the reason why Paul is going to advance this type of theology is that Paul teaches that man is utterly unredeemed, sinful, and although technically a person can keep all the law and be saved, but no one can keep all the law. We're all sinners. We all fall short of God's glory, and therefore you have, Jesus who died for your sins, and the death and resurrection of Jesus being preeminent in Jesus' sonship and salvation is central to all of Paul's letters, Romans 1 all the way through. But think of it this way. This is where the problem happens. This is like just you mess with a circuit board that's perfect, the motherboard, you change it here, the whole thing fries. What happens is then, if we are all utterly depraved, totally depraved, I'm using a term that Calvinists use, but if there's nothing we can do of our own volition that is just and right, we can't do anything because we can't save ourselves. No initiative of our own can save us. Look, if you've ever hung out in a church, you know what I'm talking about. This is not foreign. Then how could you even choose to believe in Jesus? Got it? You understand? So Paul is always going to have to explain how did anybody come to believe in Jesus for two reasons. One reason, the obvious one I did. If man is who nobody wants the gospel, no one, no, not one. Again, it's a ripped Psalm 14 out of context completely. I'm not going to go there. So then how could you believe in Jesus? How could you do that? That's what happens. If you're familiar with circuitry, you do what's called systems theory. If you take any perfect system, okay, if you know anything about electronics, about, and all you do is if you take a motherboard of a really fancy computer and you just change one circuit, it's not like just that look, now F8 won't, or F2, if you change a switch, now F2 won't now mean rename. No, everything changes. The whole thing fries because everything affects something else. And this is what happened in Christianity. Once you change something that, besides supposed to die for our sins, oh, really? Then everything changed, and now we're stuck with all this crazy theology. I know I said that it's not complimentary, but now you Christians understand why you have all this stuff going on. That's complete so foreign to the earliest Christians. But this is where it comes from. But if you want to know what the sovereignty of God is, of course, you would look at Deuteronomy chapter 30. God says, before I place life and death, good and evil, you must choose life that you may live. Incidentally, those who reject or partially reject, and I want to get into this too much, that part, they would say that God has to help you, but you've got to make that initiative, and then there's a grace, an efficacious grace that comes in to help you along. But I don't want to get far in that. Your question specifically is, where does the Christian Bible say that in unambiguous terms? Obviously, I've hinted to Paul. I've hinted to Paul's last letter. That means indisputed last letter. There are other letters that are ascribed to Paul that were clearly written much later, but they're not, I don't believe, authentically from him. But the last letter of Paul is the book of Romans, written in the late 50s. Okay, he's also writing it to churches in Rome that he has never been to. He will be there, but he's never been there yet. Okay, and I would be looking at, I think, the passages that Christians would point to is Romans 8, 28 through 30, just three passages. We know that in everything God works for good with those who love him, who are called according to his purpose. But those whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of the Son, in order that he might be the firstborn among, or like first fruits, among many brethren. And those whom he predestined, he called, and those whom he called, he also justified. That's where justification comes from. And those who he justified, he also glorified. What is most vital is Tanakh. This is like just an amazing tragedy. It brings me back to my own childhood, growing up in Brooklyn. I know it's hard to tell from my British accent, but in Borough Park, Brooklyn, there was one church. That was it. Holy Ghost Church on 17th Avenue and like 40th Street, around there. Big, very prominent Catholic church in the middle of the largest Jewish neighborhood anywhere in the world outside of Israel. And I remember passing by it and seeing the statues on the front lawn. And seeing, sometimes on Sunday, they had a wrought iron black fence. It's still there. Right in front of the church, and I could see inside. You'd see statues and things, and I go, where did they come up with this? How did they go from that to this? It just blew my mind away. How did this happen? I gotta tell you this very funny thing. I was watching this on YouTube very quickly. St. Catherine's Church, which is a Orthodox church in what is called Mount Sinai, in the Sinai Peninsula. I've been there. I didn't go into the church. I didn't go up on the mountain, but I passed it because I was traveling through the Sinai on numerous occasions. So there was a documentary on YouTube, and as it turns out, the spokesperson for St. Catherine's is actually a Texas guy, an American guy who speaks like a Texan. He's all dressed up like an Orthodox priest. And I'll never forget this, and you could probably YouTube this, where they interview the guy who's kind of runs St. Catherine's, who's a spokesman for it, and I'm like in shock, because he sounds like, I don't mean beating, but he sounds like a truck driver, So he's wearing with the long beard and the whole regalia, like this. But then he starts talking, and he sounds like someone on Interstate 35, driving an 18-wheeler. And he says this, and I'm watching him, and he says, isn't it interesting that we're here at St. Catherine's, I don't remember which one, Discovery Channel, whatever it is, and we're on the mountain where Moses declares, you shall have no graven images of anything that flies in the heaven above, on the earth below. And here we are, and of course, in this church, if you don't know, Orthodox churches are loaded with all statues and icons and paintings that are a part of worship, or that are venerated everywhere. I had evangelical Christians who I know who went to, just to visit an Orthodox church in Israel, who went into the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. They told me they wanted to vomit. Evangelicals were blown their minds. Wow, they couldn't believe it. They were so shocked that to see. It's not like a Catholic church. I don't know. Maybe in Brazil it's a little bit more. There's a lot more icons going on in Central America, or South America, but in the Orthodox churches, they're kissing paintings and pens and pencils, and the smoking, and there's things flying and jumping and there's statues. So I remember he said this. I've never said this ever to anybody. I'm watching. So he said, he's juxtaposing it. He said, it's interesting that we're on the mountain where Moses declared, you have seen no image, you shall have no graven images. And here we are. We have all these icons and all these statues and all these whatever it's called. So I'm waiting for him to do the punchline. Like, I'm at least waiting for him to do an explanation of why they've got so many statues and why they have so many icons everywhere of Mary and the saints. Don't ask. So where's the rub? Let me hear your explanation of how dare you're on the mountain where it was declared, and you've got statues and getchkas and psilim everywhere. Here it is. Now he's going to give us, this is why. And it just ends. And I'm watching, did I miss something? He just says, isn't it striking? These are not exactly his words. He seems like a really nice guy, by the way. Really normal. Not some snake handler from, no, this guy sounds like totally so cerebral, with a big beard and he's wearing all the outfits, don't ask what he's wearing. And he goes, imagine, here we are on the mountain. Moses said, don't have any images, and here we are with all these images. And I'm going, so I guess you're going to explain why there's a seeming contradiction, an obvious contradiction. But in your mind, you're not, you didn't have a concussion. You're going to explain how you could possibly rationalize this. And it just drops. He doesn't explain. I'm going, what? What's your, how? And it doesn't. It's astonishing. Where we are is that once you change one thing, I remember my father, he should be well, describing, my father was a student of Rav Moshe Feinstein, the greatest rabbinic decisive, halachic Jewish law decisive of the 20th century. My father was a disciple of, my father is alive, he should live well and healthy. Rav Moshe Feinstein passed away years ago. My father was his student, and Moshe he used a parable of how things can go so far. Here you have Deuteronomy 30. Before you place life and death, good and evil, you must choose life that you may live. And you have Ezekiel 18, verse 21, 22, 23. As for the wicked person, if he'll turn away from his sinful ways, he shall surely live and do what is right in the eyes of the Lord. He will live and he will not die. And then next, and his sins will not be remembered against him. And then God says, is it my desire at all to punish the wicked, or is it rather he turns away from his sinful ways that he might live? Look it up for yourself. How could you have predestination? Here it's clear that the Almighty gave us a gift of free will, of choice. We could choose one way or the other. If we can't choose, then we're all a bunch of robots. So my father used to drive his Rabbi, Moshe Feinstein, and my father described me growing up some of the conversations. And Moshe Feinstein, Zacharin Levracha, said that, when you have like a point and an angle, so let's say the angle is only 1 degree. You have two lines that go out of a point, single point, and it's only 1 degree. There's only 1 degree. That's it. It's a 1 degree angle. So when you're very close to the beginning, to the point, they seem very close together. But the further you move away from that point, the two lines, if you measure them, become further and further and further apart. And if you keep going down traveling, watching both lines go, they become wider and wider apart. And eventually, if you keep going, they become on one end of the universe to the other end of the universe. That's what happened. When Christianity started, maybe it started with a person who was saying the end of the world is here, and he got crucified, and people thought he rose from the dead, and then they thought, well, how could a good man get crucified? He couldn't die for his own sins. He must have died for everybody else. And then it adds up, and then if he's the son of God, he can't just be like this. He has to be born of a virgin like Romulus was, and so on. And that's what happened. So it starts off in Jerusalem. You have a movement that literally starts in Jerusalem, but by the time it arrives in Rome, you have something that's almost completely unrecognizable. And that's what's happening. And that's what we observe in Christianity. It starts with a little knetch. It starts with the deviation in the beginning. What were they deviating? There was no Christmas. There was no Easter, no Doctrine of Trinity, none of that stuff. None of that. That all comes later. Paul is going to go, you don't have to keep mitzvahs anymore. You want to eat from meat that was sacrificed to idols? Good. If it doesn't mean anything to you, what does it matter? 1 Corinthians 8. V'chula, v'chula, v'chula. So in answering that, of course, we could look at many passages in Romans 8, 9, 10. Interestingly, I'm not going to go off on long on this because there's plenty of literature. You don't need this. It's interesting that the same passages in Romans, the same chapters in Romans that are used by those who who insist that there's a predestination and a double predestination, which means who's going to heaven, who's going to hell, are the same chapters that those who oppose this theology, they use the same sources for it. And they go, this is why you're wrong. But the true answer is that we have to come back to the Torah itself. If God says, now I see you are righteous, what do you mean now? And when Abraham passed this test, we know if God foreordained that Abraham would be righteous. What are you talking about? That now I know that you are righteous. No, the whole Torah doesn't make any sense. But you can see how the church will ultimately, if there's any conflict between Paul and the teachings of Moses, teachings of Joshua, teachings of Hezekiah, Isaiah, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, they will jettison the Jewish scriptures. That's from the Old Testament. And they will then embrace it with this spiritual abomination of Christianity, and remember this, Rome did not convert to Christianity. Christianity converted to Rome. The time has to end. And the church, the people who are in the church, many of them are good people, don't know any better. These parishioners have to look back at the Jewish scriptures, have to hold up the claims of the church in light of the Jewish scriptures, not the other way around. If our brothers and sisters in the church who are never in darkness, who can't even read their own Bible in its original language, if they will measure, that's what the word canon is. It's a measuring reed by which all that is true can be known. If the teachings of Moses of blessed memory, great teacher, if that is our shining light, if that is the testimony upon which we found our faith, then you will see, not like today, just thousands of Christians, but you'll see millions and millions of Christians worldwide jettisoning all these innovations of the church, jettisoning all of Greece and Rome, and returning back to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So thank you so much for that question.
אדון עולם אשר מלך בטרם כל יציר נברא לעת נעשה בחפצו כל אזי מלך שמו נקרא ואחרי ככלות הכל לבדו ימלוך נורא והוא היה והוא הווה